CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.
Helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Welcome to the CURES Show, where we explore cutting-edge wellness from credible sources. I'm Kara Sundlin. As President Trump vows to shut down the Department of Education, how will the needs of our students with learning differences be met? Especially a big concern for parents who have kids with ADHD or autism or dyslexia, other learning differences. Today, child psychologist Dr. Laura Saunders is joining me to make sure your kids who might learn differently can still get their needs met regardless of what happens at the federal level. Dr. Saunders, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Kara.
You know, we've talked a lot about this, but I realize it could be new to some parents who don't even have something called a 504 or an IEP yet. So I want everyone to know we're going to get into how you can protect your kids, get their rights taken care of, help them learn better, and maybe hopefully soothe some worry of those who are concerned that things could be drastically changing if the Department of Education really does shut down. So let's start from the beginning, right? There is a federal civil right that actually prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities, and that could be even things just learning differences like ADHD or being on the spectrum.
So yes, this is, I think, a great opportunity to kind of start from the basics and talk about, where some of this information comes from. So let's start with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, it was signed into law in 1990, so about 35 years ago. And as part of the ADA, it includes children, and it includes children in schools. And so understanding that federal civil rights law prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. So it covers schools, workplaces, and housing. And so really looking at what that means for, individuals who have a disability. You use the term 504, right? It's not uncommon that you hear that someone has what's called a 504 plan. So that 504 comes from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that civil rights law prohibits discrimination in any program that gets federal money, so including public schools. So colleges don't necessarily have 504 plans, but they still must provide accommodations.
Okay, so a 504 plan can really cover any condition that limits your daily activities in a major way. So it might be if you're noticing your kid learns differently. I went through this with my son. He couldn't sit in his chair. He was bouncing all over the place. We would later learn he had ADHD, but that was the first step was a 504, where it could be some simple accommodations that could make school better. Is that right?
Yes. So often it starts with, a diagnosis or an assessment. So schools are mandated to provide an assessment based on need, right? They can't do full, educational or psychological assessments on everyone. But when there's a documented need, when the teachers, sort of collaborate with the parents and they indicate that a child seems to be falling behind in their learning, having significant mental health issues, that could be a need. ADHD or attentional issues, that could be a need. So it starts with a need and then coming up with a diagnosis, because generally to get services, you need a diagnosis.
Okay, so that's 504 plan. Then how does that differ from an IEP or an individualized educational plan?
So an individualized education plan, or IEP, is under the guidelines of special education. Special education is, I think of them like sisters. 504 plans and IEPs are like sisters. As a general rule, IEPs are done when the level of disability is a little bit more severe or overarching, or has been, going on for a longer period of time. You have diagnostic categories under an IEP, like, these might be a little bit old, but like socially, emotionally maladjusted used to be a fairly common IEP. I mean, you can get it for physical disabilities too. If a child has cerebral palsy or other physical disabilities that affect their ability to learn or their ability to physically access their education, they might have an IEP. And, another overarching guideline that really needs to be emphasized is the mandate is that children are educated in the least restrictive environments. So they most often should be educated alongside their peers, unless their level of disability is so severe, and that could be physical disability or social emotional disability, that they need an outplacement. But that's probably a separate.
Okay, so, just to put it in, I guess, plain terms, I remember hearing that a 504 was, I don't know if you're going to agree with this, but one person in the mental health field once told me that a 504 is sort of like a rider. Like, if a singer comes to the XL Center and says, well, I need this kind of water, this kind of chair, I need to go on this time, that kind of, and then an IEP might be, the accommodations could be more in depth, they might be greater, and they have perhaps bigger needs to fill.
Yeah, okay, I can sort of wrap my mind around that the IEP is I see it as more serious or more in depth, whereas a 504 plan, I mean, again, you still need a diagnostic category for any of these things.
Okay.
And again, you can get if you, God forbid, break your leg, your child breaks their leg in school, or breaks their leg and they need, an accommodation around either, using a wheelchair or using crutches, you can get a 504 plan for physical as well as mental health issues.
Okay, right.
So
and it might be for a shorter period of time too, if it's something like that, once you're healed. So a lot of people are concerned that if President Trump really does get rid of the Department of Education that I guess oversees these federal laws, how would your kids who have these IEPs or 504s be affected?
So the reason I kind of started out by sharing is that right now, these things are written into federal law. So the Department of Education, and granted, there's a Department of Education within each state too, but the Department of Education is mandated with providing support and helping with follow through with these laws, but they're already federal laws. So I can't predict what's going to happen in the federal government, but we know that there's a Connecticut State Department of Education, and that State Department of Education is mandated with following the laws. So because these are Americans with Disabilities Act and the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act are federal laws. So we can't get away from following the law in these situations.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the accommodations. These are assuming you already have one. I do want to let parents know. I'll ask you in a little bit about if you don't have one, you think you need one, how you get it. But let's just say why you might want one, or if you do have one, I know a lot of times you have meetings every year to update them. Regardless of what's happening on the White House, you should still be having those meetings, these PPT meetings, talking about accommodations, evaluating them. So some of the simplest accommodations might be just preferential seating. If you have a kid who gets very distracted, they might just sit in the front. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are levels of accommodations based on what the issue is or what the disability is, right? Preferential seating would be an accommodation. Extended time on tests and assignments might be an accommodation. Reduced homework or reduced classwork might be an accommodation. Having verbal or technology aids might be an accommodation. Audio visual materials, behavior management support. So there's all sorts of accommodations that can happen to better facilitate learning for our young people.
I think some people think it's really hard to get one of these, especially if maybe they live in places where it's not supported as much or people aren't as educated about this. And one of your suggestions is ask your school personnel if your child needs a 504. Does that work? Are they usually nice to give you one, or do you have to fight for it?
So I would say, in my experience in working with almost all the districts at some point in the state of Connecticut, that there are definitely differences in how districts support their students.
Okay.
And that being said, the number one most important thing is parent advocacy.
Okay.
Parents know their kids and they know when there's something wrong. And parent advocacy, being that squeaky wheel that will get the grease, is critically important. Now, you do start with your school support personnel. And I would also say that most often schools want to do the right thing by their students, right? So you start with your school support personnel, you bring up your concerns as a parent, either you get corroborating information from teachers or the school support personnel, the school social worker, school psychologist, sometimes there's speech and language pathologists, occupational therapy, physical therapy, because those are accommodations that you can have in school as well. You start with your school support personnel, you get their input, and then you generally have to make a formal request for an assessment or testing.
Okay. I think I was very lucky because, at least in my case, I had a very well-informed principal in elementary school. I didn't even know what a 504 was, and she suggested that my son reminded her of her grandson and that he might need a 504, and I was like, okay, what's that? And we just talked about it. And then, in these decades since, I've learned so much from folks like you and helped other moms and dads advocate. Some people are worried. I don't want my kid to be different. I don't want a plan. I don't want anything. First of all, I know a lot of kids have these plans. Some people hire lawyers and spend all this money fighting for them, which is a whole nother issue of access. But what about the thing that says, no, I don't want my kid to know that they have any differences?
So I think that was very common a decade or two ago, if not longer. But the reality is more and more children need some form of accommodation to better support their learning, right? So we want young people to get access to the services that are made available within the public school system. Even some private schools now are more and more willing to provide access to additional services when they can. But schools are actually, they're legally mandated to provide services. Yeah. So with advocacy, with assessment and a diagnosis, we can, a plan is developed. And so in that plan, what we want to do is make sure that these young people get the best education that they can in the least restrictive environment.
Okay. So let's just say that you think that you need one and you're worried that the certain climate isn't going to allow for it now. Should we be worried about that? Or parents who are finding out about needs are still just as entitled to these accommodations and plans as they were before this current presidency?
So this is where parents really need to do their homework, right? And, I just told you, Americans with Disabilities Act, Rehabilitation Act of 1973, that's where the 504 plans come from. I would hate for everyone to have to hire attorneys because attorneys are massively expensive. But it does require some advocacy on the parents' part to get educated and to then advocate to the schools. Mm-hmm. The most important thing here is that we are not trying to single out students. We are trying to integrate students and get them support and access so that they can learn in that least restrictive environment. And, there's actually more and more kids, as I said, that have various accommodations. So I don't think it's as stigmatized as it was a decade or 2 decades ago.
Yeah. So if you, would you start with your pediatrician as far as making sure you have that letter of diagnoses? I know sometimes they need an actual diagnosis.
Yeah, honestly, if the school notices that there's a problem, the school can actually do the assessment, right? They have school psychologists that are there to do assessments. The school can do the assessment. There's educational assessments, and then there's psychological assessments, and then there's kind of psychoeducational assessments based on whatever the particular needs are of the child. So the schools can do those. However, they have, I think it's about 45 days from the time a parent puts in a formal request for an assessment. They have 45 days to do that. So it's not a fast turnover process.
Okay.
If you have the means to get access to services outside of the school, an outside assessment, to get a diagnosis. You can do that, but not everyone has those means. So I like people to know that you can actually, you have to specifically request, often in writing, that what your documented concern is and that you're requesting an assessment.
Yeah, I'll just throw out a free tip that I feel like I've learned over the years having a child with ADHD was, as friends went to go to try to get this ball rolling, you can actually Google the Vanderbilt form and just fill it out, at least your parent version, starting, and then give it to the teacher and have them fill it out. And so you don't waste that couple of weeks just for someone to give you a form to start and do it. So I guess a lot of this stuff is available online. I think parents are afraid maybe they don't know which one they should use. They don't know. So I guess starting with a pediatrician and hopefully starting with the school. But if you're getting pushback from the school for whatever reason, then you have to be the squeaky wheels with your advice.
You have to be the squeaky wheel. I mean, this is I think a life lesson, but it's certainly a lesson in the education system, is that parents need to be the strongest advocates for their children. They know their children well. They understand that they're struggling in A, B, and C area. It could be a learning issue. It could be a social emotional issue. So parents need to advocate. And that means sometimes being repetitive in your advocacy, checking back in a week later with the school support personnel saying, I put this request in a week ago. What's the status on it? Can we meet and discuss it? Right? The more formal meeting when you have an IEP is an individualized education plan, is called a PPT, right? The planning and placement team meeting.
Yeah.
So they have to have, anyone that has an IEP, I might be getting too much in the weeds here, but anyone who has an IEP, an individualized education plan, needs a yearly PPT. And when you have an IEP, you need what's called a triennial. Every 3 years, you need to have a full assessment done. And that's called a triennial assessment.
Okay.
Triennial.
So maybe they were assessed in elementary school and there were some questions about what was going on and you made some accommodations that may not be appropriate for middle school or high school. You might need to add on. And now the other thing is a lot of parents have grown up thinking, all right, they got through it. They got through middle school, they got through high school, they're fine. Now they're just going to go to college, and not realizing, I didn't know this, that a lot of these accommodations can carry over to college. And should we be telling the colleges about this? I mean, I've heard that some kids are entitled, if they're, have a poor working memory and they're better with listening, that they get note takers or I guess preferential seating as a kid. You can go, you're an adult now, you can go choose to sit in the front. But how does this carry over for college? How do we make sure that our older teens are advocating? Do we get involved?
So this is a great question, Kara, and it does get a little trickier with college. In my experience, I've seen many circumstances where teens and parents say, you know what, they had these accommodations for years. They really seem to have learned a lot from them. I really want to give them the opportunity to just go to college and advocate for themselves or just try to manage things on their own. And that's great and well-intentioned. However, in my experience, most often that those same learning or social emotional issues that came up in high school will come up in college as well. So it is often my recommendation that you start off by contacting, every college has a, they're called different things. Student support office, disability office, they're called different things in different colleges, but they all have them. And so to contact them, to inform them of either the IEP or the 504 plan that your child had in college. Now, here's the thing. At this point now, your teenager, your soon to be college freshman actually needs to do some of this advocacy themselves, which can be a little bit frustrating for parents because they feel like their teen won't follow through with that. But they do need to then go to that office, introduce themselves, sort of get this ball rolling on their own. Because in my experience, it's nice to want to start with a clean slate, but inevitably those same problems that were there in high school might need the same accommodations in college as well.
What do you do? I don't know that this is happening, but I know that we're getting a lot of feedback from parents who are worried about things changing and at the federal level and what the new ideas are. So I guess the most important thing you're saying is nothing changed with federal law. All of these rights are protected. What do you do if the teacher, the principal, the organization you have to deal with is saying, no, we don't do that. We don't have to do that.
Well, and that happens. And as I said, in my experience, that there are some districts that are just amazing, and yes, we will do this. Yes, we'll get this done as soon as we can. And some districts where you have to actually really fight and push. And no, that's often a top-down attitude. It usually starts with the superintendent and trickles down to principals and then the school support staff. And again, I totally believe that school support staff want to do what's right by the students in that school. But I've seen countless examples where I just had to, I had to either encourage the parent to keep advocating, or if they've formed a relationship with me, I've had to step in and do some advocacy. So I think sometimes getting your child some outside help or support with the therapist, if it's certainly if it's a social emotional issue, even with learning issues as well, there are pretty significant learning disabilities that can have an impact on kids.
Okay.
And then often I want a neuropsychologist, but to get outside help and support before you even get to the lawyers to help you with your advocacy.
Okay. I do want to take a moment and just hear from our sponsor. We'll be right back to talk about more ways to make sure you're protecting your kids in these changing times.
Struggling with gambling? Wheeler Health's Better Choice program offers personalized support and treatment to help you regain control. Visit wheelerhealth.org to learn more and take the first step towards recovery today.
And we're back talking about how any federal changes right now, with the word of the Department of Education perhaps being disbanded or even shut down, how will that affect kids who have learning differences, who are perhaps on the spectrum or have ADHD, dyslexia, and are operating with some different learning accommodations. We're here with Dr. Laura Saunders, a child psychologist, and I think the most important thing parents need to hear, even if they want to clip this and send it, nothing has changed. The law is still the same. It may be administered by the state Department of Education, which here in Connecticut, I think we're pretty good in that department as far as them understanding all this, but nothing has changed. Even if they get rid of the Department of Education and it goes under a different division, the laws about protecting kids with any kind of learning challenge have not changed, and you're entitled to exactly the same things as you ever were.
Yes, I mean, to the best of our ability to predict the future, these are federal laws that are still in place. And, I really want to encourage parents to get as much information as they can, educate themselves, find out what they feel that their child needs. There are, lists of accommodations that a child can have, and things that might be helpful, because we want all our kids to have sort of an equal footing in how they move themselves forward. I do feel strongly that not everyone needs to go to college, that we actually should really do a better job with some of our alternate learners and have them look at trades. We need electricians and plumbers and HVAC people and also all sorts of IT folks who might not want to go to college. There's lots of things out there for those alternative learners. So to be aware of that as well.
Okay. So, right, depending on if you have a child who just really doesn't thrive in school. I think part of the problem is sometimes it's confusing for parents. There are certain kind of learning challenges that are very, very clear, and everybody would be on board with them. Maybe you can even see them more. But in cases of where, let's say the child is constantly forgetting to turn in the homework or not doing it, and they're thinking, well, this kid's just lazy. They're like everybody else, you got to do what this kid does. And then as you learn, you go through this process that it may be they literally have executive function challenges and you need some accommodations, not to excuse the work, but that this kid is not working the same way that someone else is. And so how do you make sure that if you have something that's not seen, that you can even explain some of how this works and why it's affecting your child? Where some teachers might be reticent to be like, no, I'm not giving any special treatment. This is just not done.
So that's a great point, because it's, I would say a good part of the time, whatever the issue is not always clear, right? You can have anxiety as a driving issue, and that could result in, as you said, not doing homework, not turning in homework, having stomach aches in the morning and wanting to miss class, right? And so now it's just like you have this plethora of different symptoms or behaviors that you have no idea how to understand, and that in that situation, that anxiety might be the driver in that. So I do, think sometimes the parents need the help of again, school support personnel, outside psychologists, clinical social workers, folks that can help them better interpret some of this behavior and then take those next steps. Because sometimes it just looks muddy and it looks like a whole slew of different behaviors that don't make sense. What you often see is a change in functioning that, this time of year, this is the spring, right? In the fall, they were generally functioning well in their core areas, which for young people is school, home, and social and play. They were functioning well in all those areas, but in the past 2 or 3 months, you've seen a change in functioning. You're seeing behaviors that you just didn't see in the fall and you didn't see last year. So when you see that change in functioning, that is a clue that something's wrong, and it's to be determined what exactly is driving those changes in behavior and emotion.
So as we come to our last few minutes, I want to help parents with resources. I wish everyone could have Dr. Saunders on speed dial. She's a child psychologist at the Institute of Living. And I know that's not possible, although you do give so much information away freely, which we so appreciate. But if you're feeling frustrated and you don't have one of those schools, it's like, here, let me give you this test, let me give you that test. Where are some resources so you can learn what you need to ask for, learn what's going to help, and kind of get yourself educated so you can advocate?
There are a lot of good online resources. I'm not always good about coming up with them off the top of my head. What I do worry about in some of these situations is using, as my sister jokingly referred to it the other day, Dr. Google, right, to, put things in and then come up with a formula, or, your Chat GPT or your AI, I call her Wanda. So I don't always want to use that as a definitive resource. It's one piece of information, but you want to use your own kind of instincts as a parent. You want to get corroborating information. So don't take any one piece of information as, the solid fact. Use it as one of many sources of information. Then ask for help and support from your school support personnel.
Absolutely. All right, Dr. Laura Saunders, thank you for being here. You can find Dr. Laura Saunders on Instagram at Dr. Laura Saidi, right? Is that how you say it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And of course, at the Institute of Living at Hartford HealthCare. Thank you so much for being with us, everyone. Have a great day and be well.
Thank you.
CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.